do you think that often, as a young minister as myself, do you think that we try to we'll say overcomplicate a message to instead of just go simple, bare bones to get the message across, as you said, because we're not preaching to a group of ministers, we're preaching to unsaved people. Do you believe that often that's the case?
I think that's far too often the case. Here's what I would say. I think a couple things, and I would say especially your generation. So I'm not picking on your generation. I'm just observing. I think there's so much pressure, even through like social media. Everybody's on YouTube. All these megachurch preachers are on YouTube, whatever. And I think, thankfully, in the apostolic movement, we have great preachers and great communicators. But here's what I think. Preaching or teaching is truth through your personality. So if I'm trying to be Anthony Mangan when I preach, it's not truth through my personality. It's a fake. And people can sense that. And sometimes I feel like in this generation, because we've been exposed to so much preaching on YouTube and everywhere, sometimes I feel like everybody's trying to be a clone of somebody else. And so we're not getting truth through personality. We're getting a performance of Pentecostal style. You know, it's excitable, it's loud, it's intense, and it's meant to build up to this. Well, great, especially if you're preaching to preachers or established saints. But if you're trying to communicate to a new person, they can be really put off if we're using buzzwords and catchphrases and terms that only we would understand. They can also be put off by our intensity, because sometimes we get so intense, they're not even hearing what we're saying. So I'm not against intensity. I get intense and I'll roar and holler and whatever, but I want to communicate in the way that that God has wired me, because that's the only thing that's authentic. So I think sometimes in your generation, we feel a lot of pressure to preach in a certain way and to all be clones of somebody else. Now, in the United Pentecostal Church, of which I'm part, if I go back a generation or two, I see people like, these names may mean nothing to the people that are listening, or they may know these names. Nathaniel Urshan was very different than James Kilgore, was very different than J.T. Pugh, was very different than T.F. Tenney, was very different than, and you just start, T.W. Barnes, and you just start going through. If I look back a generation, these elders were great men of God, but they all were very, very different. Their styles were different. Some of them just talked. Some of them never got like loud and excitable. Today, I feel like we're all trying to compete with like the mega church pastor or the conference preacher style of preaching. And I think that's counterproductive, because it binds you or me to something that is not authentic. And I think I think we have a good chance in this generation to really turn that around. I've had missionaries come by this church that their preaching wouldn't entertain anybody here. But our church, we've taught our church, sometimes missionaries come and they're not going to preach North American style. They're going to preach in the style that's effective in their field. And they could be in let's say an Asian mission field where the culture is a little more sedate. They're not going to get up and yell, because when they preach in their culture, God wired them to be able to communicate there. And I think we have to learn that and remember that. So I hope that comes somewhere near close to answering your question.
It does. And lastly is, if a young minister is going to use, as you said, resources, there are good resources that
For sure.
are by Trinitarians and other things, yes. But I'll use the Dake Bible, for example.
Yes, sir.
They have to remember to be grounded in what they know to begin with.
Yes.
Correct? And never preach certain verses out of those commentaries, correct?
Basically, my friend Terry Schock says it this way: you've got to have a good apostolic filter. When you read when you read blogs, when you read books, when you listen to preaching, whatever, you have to have an apostolic filter. There again is where your pastor comes into play. Your pastor should have veto power to say, you're on the wrong track there. Now, pastor doesn't listen to everything I preach, and I don't get to listen to everything he preaches. Thankfully, with the online stuff, we could, but we're busy, so we don't do that. But if I was doing something that I thought was the least bit like on edge or controversial, or I was wondering how to present it, I would be running that by him. And every once in a while, he'll call and say, he's way beyond me in ministry. I hope someday to achieve like 1/10 of what he's achieved. But sometimes he'll call and we'll discuss something at his initiative. He's not doing that because he needs information from me. He's doing that because we're having a conversation and we're feeding back to each other. He's doing more teaching to me, but we're dialoguing on something, and I value that. I'm probably. I think pastor would say this if he was on the other side of this call. There's some areas where probably my culture here, my upbringing, personal convictions, there's probably some areas where I'm more conservative than pastor would be in some areas. There's other areas where he would be more conservative than me, perhaps. That doesn't mean we can't fellowship or we can't be united. It just means that it's the balance of ministry. So, I think those voices are, to come back to your very first question, those voices are really important in your life. And if more young men would have relationships with elders and with their pastor, we'd have less guys straying off the bar doctrinally. I don't pay attention to anybody out there in the charismatic world, in the mega church world. I don't pay attention to any of them for doctrine. Zero. If they can't even get the new birth right, then doctrinally I'm out. Inspiration, sure. Sometimes they preach, great faith messages, great inspirational messages, what I call, Christian living messages, like getting through trials, overcoming sorrow, like pick any subject. So they're good on those areas, inspirational areas. But if they can't even get the new birth right or the baptism of the Holy Ghost right, they're not going to inform me on doctrine. So I have no voices in doctrinal areas from out there because they don't have the basics right. Now, if somebody's got the basics right, then I can open myself to them for doctrinal things. If somebody doesn't even get the oneness of God, I'm not going to be studying any of their books on the Godhead. So I've got a bar, and if you don't meet that bar, oneness of God, a holy lifestyle, the new birth, if you don't meet that, you're back on my inspiration reading list. You are not on my doctrinal reading list. Now, if you're apostolic, I'll read whatever you got. I might not agree with it, but I'm open to reading it.
Amen. Do you see any other challenges facing young ministers today?
A couple of things. One is we've still got to figure out, Brother Fig, what we're going to do with the whole social media generation. There's a whole lot of comparison, a whole lot of controversy, and a whole lot of criticism floating around online. We have not dealt well with that. I just did a series on social media, I think it was last year, called Selfie. It was like a 4-part series and just really dealt with the church on social media, because social media is such an influencer. And I think, those 3 areas, we're comparing each other, we're criticizing each other, and we're creating controversy one with another. And that's dangerous to me. So I think your generation, and I'm sorry to say it that way, but I'm old, so that's the deal. But I think your generation needs to figure out, how are we going to successfully negotiate that? We got to take all the principles we've always said we believe. A soft answer turns away wrath. We got to take that principle and now apply it to the online world. Those that compare themselves among themselves are not wise. We got to take that and apply it to Facebook and Twitter and Instagram or whatever. All of those principles we've got to take and apply online. So that's one area that's brand new for your generation. This is the first generation that's ever had to deal with social media as I was born with it. I've grown up with it. I'm a native to it. You know, I use social media, but I learned it when I was like 50 years old. So that's a whole different ball of wax than somebody that was on Instagram when they were 8 or 10 or 15. That's a whole different ball of wax. So that's one thing I think is a challenge for your generation, because the online world is now as real as the real world. It is what it is. So there's huge benefits there. I've got friends in Singapore. I've got friends in Africa. I've got friends in, Central America, all over the world, that it's because of being able to access them online. So there's huge benefits. We have a webcast. There's huge benefits. Boy, there's some huge dangers there. Another thing for your generation, I think, which is probably the biggest thing, and we started here in a way, because we were talking about, voices and influencers and pastors. Submission has to be a factor, because everything your generation has been taught is anti-submission. Be your own person, be an individual, you can do it. Your opinion's as valuable as anybody else's. Don't let anybody tell you what to do. And then it even bends and morphs into your truth is your truth. Like, it gets weird out there in the world. There's never been a generation where all generations have faced this, that the pressure from the world. I mean, you go back to ancient Corinth, the pressure in that immoral city was infiltrating into the church, and Paul had to deal with it. So there's never been a generation that didn't have to deal with this. But I think the current generation really has to watch that, we have to stand up against culture and say, no, I'm submitted to the word of God. I don't care that somebody else doesn't like that. And here, we can get away with that. Here's the one we don't get away with. I'm submitted to my pastor. There are people that will push back on that. I've had people say, I don't need a pastor. I'm of age. I make my own decisions. I literally have had people say to me, I wouldn't surrender control of my ministry to somebody else. I disagree. I think there's safety in that somebody else, I trust them. I trust their relationship with God. And my pastor has veto power over me. I think submission is something for every generation, but especially this generation, where everything in culture says, no, that's stupid. Don't do that. Don't surrender your rights yourself. So I think those things would be a couple of things that are really important for your generation. And I'll mention one more just because it kind of ties in with social media, but yet it's far worse. And that is, we're being hit with a terrible, terrible crisis in the lives of young people and even ministers and saints with the plague of pornography. It's everywhere, and it is hurting us. We're raising up a generation, because they're familiar with a Pentecostal style. They can come and raise their hands and sing the songs and do whatever they do, but privately, personally, they're ensnared and they're trapped, and it's robbing their confidence before God. It's robbing their joy. And it's also robbing their potential to have normal dating relationships, normal, interaction with the opposite sex. It's just a plague. And I think your generation has to figure out a way to really be accountable there. Now, that comes into both areas I just mentioned, social media and submission. Accountability in the area of what you do online, and to be accountable to your man of God, your pastor. So really, it all fits together. Those are a couple of challenge areas that I see. And that's not a critique, Brother Fig. This is the greatest generation I've ever seen as far as young people passionate for God and wanting to make a difference. So it's not a critique. I admire this generation so much. But every generation, the devil tries to take them out. And so those are a couple of areas that I think are really important.
So I know I keep asking, but I'm going to ask this. So to put it down, be submittive, but be submittive by allowing that person in your life to have a full view of your life, not just a 60, 75%,
No,
but be completely open to them.
absolutely. Because other than that, I pick and choose. That's the challenge with mentors. I can be mentored by a whole lot of people. I've been mentored by John Maxwell. I've never met him. I don't know him, but I've read some of his books. So, there's some great leadership principles that guy's taught. And so he's mentored me. I can say that. But I don't listen to him. I don't even know him. I've never talked to him. There's other people that I do know and I do talk to, and I allow them to mentor me in certain areas. I've gone to conferences just to learn how somebody does whatever, outreach, preaching, church structure. So I can say they're a mentor, especially if I then continue a relationship with them and ask them questions and learn. Hopefully my voice today would be a mentoring voice to somebody that watches this or listens to it. It would be a mentoring voice, but I'm not their pastor. That's a different thing. And so to come back around to the submission, two statements I always make on submission would be this. Number one, submission is the same as submarine. A submarine means under the water. So submission means putting your mission, your ministry, your calling under somebody else's mission. Submission. So I can't be submitted unless I'm under somebody else's covering. That's the pastor. But the second thing about submission, this is the thing that everybody loves to hate about submission. I cannot be submitted when I agree. That's agreement. Agreement's powerful. Where two or three agree. Agreement is powerful. But agreement is not as powerful as submission. I am only submitted when I disagree, and I still submit. So if somebody says, let's go to the mall, and I already wanted to go to the mall today, I haven't submitted to them. I've just agreed with them. But if somebody says, let's go to the mall, and I wanted to stay home, and I said, well, okay, we'll go to the mall because you said. Now I've submitted to them. I disagreed. I didn't want to do what they said, but I've submitted. Pastor has checked that out a couple of times with me, in not in major ways. I hope it would never come to a major way where he'd have to say, you submit. But kind of in a funny way at one point, there was one year in particular, we ended up doing like 2 or 3 camp meetings together. And I don't get to be around him a lot. We live 2,500 miles apart. So, I am locked in. My pastor's there. He's preaching. And so I was doing days at this particular camp. He was doing evenings. And so I think he was doing Thursday and Friday evening. So Thursday, before he spoke that night, I think it was, he said to me, Raymond, I want you to go home tomorrow, be with your wife and all your grandkids, and I want you to go home. I said, oh, no, Pastor, I'm going to stay here. I don't get to hear you very much. I want to stay here for Friday night service, and I'll go home Saturday. And I have my ticket booked for that. And he said, nope, I want you to go home tomorrow. I want you to check out early and go home. You need some extra time. You've been on the road. I said, oh, no, Pastor, I want to stay and hear you. And plus, it will cost me a lot of money to change my ticket. He said, I don't care. I want you to go home. You need some time off. I am not going to run around the country, Brother Fig, telling everybody, submit to your pastor, if I won't submit to my pastor. So I didn't want to go home. I wanted to stay and hear him, and it cost me some money to go home. But pastor said. And so that's submission. Now, there's people that would say, you're an idiot for doing that. It cost you money. You didn't want to do that. But see, there's a higher principle at work. If I wouldn't submit to him on something so simple, who's to say I might just choose not to submit if there was a doctrinal issue some year? So submission is submission. You don't get to pick and choose what times you submit, what subjects you submit on, or turn in submission on and off. You're either submitted or you're not. So I am submitted to him. If he called right now and my cell phone rang and I saw it was Pastor, and I picked up the phone and he said, I don't want you doing that interview, I would politely say to you, see you later. Thanks for the interview, but it's over. I really believe it that much. And here's what I would say. I'm 57, Brother Fig. That still protects me to this day. I'm so grateful for it. I'm not looking to get out from under being submitted. But that one voice, you can't have 100 people like that, because if I'm submitted to pastor and 5 other people, then what happens if 3 of them say something different than him? You've got to have a pastor, and his voice trumps everybody else's voice in you. That has to be.